What is a snake doing in the story? It represents evil, but a talking snake. Yeah, the point here is it intuitive for you guys? Try and imagine that you don't know this story. Okay? Is it intuitive for you? Now, imagine you're just going into it blind, that you have the temple, you have the mountain garden, you have Adam and Eve, and things are great. And then now the serpent was more crafty. Why are we bringing in, why is the text introducing a serpent, right? It's a really good question. It kind of feels, if you didn't know the story, it kind of feels like that's a little out of the blue. It assumes that I know what this serpent is. So we're going to get into sort of what is this serpent figure, okay? So the Hebrew word for serpent is nahash, nahash, okay? So it's one of two Hebrew terms for serpent in the Bible. And it's what's used of this deceiver figure, this trickster figure in the text, right? However, this word is mysterious in its use case, since the word is closely related to other terms having to do with trickery, spell casting, and light, shimmering light. Okay, so let me demonstrate that for you a little bit. So these words, or these letters, excuse me, they form the root letters for three different Hebrew words. Okay, serpent, charm, or divine, and shining. Okay, or brazen. The idea here is that you can have a word that has multiple meanings depending on its context, right? And this is how these Hebrew letters, they show up in different contexts and they form these different things. So what scholars will sometimes put forth and demonstrate, and for good reason, is that that is what the Hebrew writer is doing in this text in use of the word serpent. And you could say even the formation of the word serpent within the Hebrew language probably took this in mind, that they are bringing together a number of different ideas into one Hebrew word. Okay. Why would they be thinking of serpents and have these connections of divination, charm, spell casting, right? Enchantment, right? As well as a sort of glimmer and a shininess. Why do you think that an ancient person would sort of make these connections? Serpent and these other things. If you encounter a serpent in your life, what is the context normally for that? They sneak up on you. That's a great one. Has anyone been on a hiking trail and you're just walking and suddenly, oh, there's a snake on the ground or there's a snake in the grass, right?
Well, when it says the shining, it reminds me of like I think Paul says that, or one of the people in the Testament say like that city was like an angel of light or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
So shining. And
Yeah, we'll get into that. Yeah. What's another experience? Think about snakes in the Middle East. Okay. What do snakes represent in the Middle East?
Oh, like they charm you.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So there are snake charmers who have mastery over snakes, right? But also let's say what happens to you if you're in the wilderness and you're in a jungle, let's say, or you're in the trees, and what happens when you see one? Or what happens when a monkey sees a snake? What is the Medusa in Greek mythology? What happens? Freezes you. Okay. What is the snake in the Jungle Book? What is the name of it? Hypnotizing, yeah. So
Great movie, by the way.
so let's just talk about the experience of snakes, okay? So in the ancient world, snakes were often perceived as chaos creatures, or at least beings residing on the fringes of ordered reality. So they live both under the land, on the land, and in the water. So they shed their skin. Snakes were sometimes conceived of as perpetually undying creatures, right? So they go through these periods of transformation. They go through this sort of sense that do they die, you know what I mean? Or do they just shed their skin, right? Serpents were often found in deserts and in holes in the ground. They were understood to be somehow connected with the underworld or the realm of chaos, right? They're dangerous and elusive. They hide low on the ground to ferociously strike out at their prey. Serpents are venomous. Their bites can rapidly be fatal. If you get bit by a snake, if Johnny from your village, 2 years ago got bit by a snake, he was gone in 15 minutes. And you always have that in your brain, that memory. of this is what snakes do to you. In the various Leviathan dragon traditions, chaos is represented as a sea serpent. So we talked quite a bit about Leviathan already, about the idea of a sea serpent, because serpents are associated in realms which humans do not belong. Remember, underworld and in the sea, this is not where humans go. Their winding and twisting bodies hold no distinct shape. So snakes are often conceived of as shapeshifters, right? As shapeshifters, because the idea here is that in this, here they look long, and here they look coiled, right? So they don't have a particular form to them. In biblical understanding, the description of the even rebel as a serpent is a profound symbol that will carry a pattern throughout the scriptures. So serpentine beings, they represent changeability. So again, the shedding of the skin, they represent unpredictability. So again, the head can be here and the tail can be here. And how is it in all of these places at one time, right? Divinity, this idea of they have a certain mastery over the world, right? This is kind of how ancient people associate. Sorry, hang on, let me turn off the sound. How ancient people associate serpents, right? Okay, and also just note that serpents, they hold profound symbolic significance. Some of the most enduring symbols in the world, they involve serpents. Does anyone know what these are? Yeah. So the it's called the rod of Asclepius, and yeah, it has to do with medical. It's a medical symbol. If you're even if you're driving on the road and you see an ambulance, you pull up behind an ambulance, and there will be the symbol of the snake on the rod. Of course, there's a biblical story associated with that as well. Anyone know what this one is? It's called the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, right? So it represents self-generation, right? The idea that you at the same time consume yourself, you make yourself, right? These very complex ideas that are associated with snakes. So they're embedded in the subconscious culturally as being sort of these divine figures, right? That show up. So these things we have to just really marinate in the thought of why a serpent. We know there's more going on than just a flesh and blood animal. Something you would see. It's not something that you would see in a zoo, right? There's something more going on here, and we want to really be thinking about that. Yeah, well, there you go. It's a talking snake. Let's get into why the snake is talking, right? And presented as talking a little bit.
It's deceiving.
Yeah, deceiving. So remember that I said serpent has two corresponding Hebrew words to it. The first one is nachash, right? Which has those sort of elements of, it can be used in different ways. If it's an adjective, then it means shining. If it's a verb, it means this other thing, right? There's also saraf. Saraf. Anyone heard of that before? The second Hebrew term for serpent is what's used for spiritual beings. In Isaiah's throne room vision, here they are described as beings with 6 wings who are part of the choirs of the heavenly dwelling of the Most High. It's really, really interesting. Why are we saying that serpents are in the throne room? So I'm going to go ahead and read it. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty. The hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And they called to one another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the thresholds shook at the voices of those who called, and the house was filled with smoke. So why, again, that word for seraph, it's a word for serpent. So we talked about serpents on the earth representing chaos creatures of the underworld, these divinity figures from the underworld. But now they're being presented, serpentine beings are being presented as calling out, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And they have wings. They have wings. Really interesting. So angelic beings, right? If you're in the throne room of God, if you're a human, you're having a vision of the throne room of God, and what you're envisioning is God and heavenly creatures, angelic beings, as we would call them, right? What is, let me ask you this, what is a serpent with wings? A dragon. Really interesting. We all understand the tradition that says that Satan is a fallen angel, right? It's a question of this figure in the garden and this satanic figure, this fallen angel figure, is created to be good, to give God glory, right? Serpents are made to glorify God, right? But as presented in Genesis chapter 3, how this serpent, how this figure, this seraph, right, is using his abilities, using his glory, right? Now it is turning him into this being that is a chaos being, right? Now remember, these are two different Hebrew words, Nahash and Seraph, right? So we want to sort of hold those things in tension. And we don't want to draw too many definitive lines. I'm trying to get you to think about things and make these connections and ponder these connections, okay? So let me just show you some archaeological stuff in regard to these seraphim, okay? So people of the ancient world, they liked to produce art of what creatures of the heavenly realm would look like, cherubim and seraphim and things like that. And so here are some depictions of winged serpents that we find in the ancient world, right? Pretty incredible. So here's this one from Egypt, right? Again, it's a serpent with wings, right? Here's one found in Judea, right? So this is found in Israel, dating back to the time of the prophets. And here's that serpent again. You see that serpent with the head and the wings, right? Yeah, it kind of looks like a dragonfly. Yeah, I thought about that as well. Here's another one with two flanking this what archaeologists will assume this circle in the middle represents Yahweh. And then you have two seraphim on the right and the left flanking the Most High God. So this idea of seraphim, right? This idea of winged creatures of the heavenly realm, right? It's not lost on the ancient writers that the cultures of the world assume that there are beings like this and figures like this, right? So remember, what is Eden? Answer for me this. What is Eden? The temple, right? The temple. So if Isaiah sees in the heavenly temple seraphs flying and crying out to God, holy, 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 giving him worship, does it make sense to have creatures in the garden that are also meant to do that? You're not tracking. So in the heavenly temple, you have seraphim flying and calling out, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. They're the part of this choir of heaven, right? If the garden represents the earthly temple, you see what I'm saying? It also makes sense to find creatures there that are meant to do the same thing. Because remember, the temple or the garden, it represents God's heavenly abode on the earth. If you're in God's temple, for example, in Jerusalem, when they build the temple of stone, you see heavenly creatures embroidered on the walls everywhere. You see what I'm saying? You see these beings, they show up throughout. The point is that they're embroidered on the tapestry and things like that, okay? So you have the presentation of a serpent in the garden, and the serpent is talking, and the garden is a temple. Is it safe to assume something more about this serpent, that he is like these beings in the throne room? This is what we get into. We haven't talked that much about it yet, but there's this concept of the divine council. I'll just read this. We'll talk more about the divine council later. But if the Garden of Eden represents Yahweh's first earthly temple, then it is natural to expect it to be populated by God's heavenly creatures. This is how the heavenly temple is described in Isaiah 6, as inhabited by God's divine council, which surrounds the throne of God. The heavenly beings there are seraphim. Okay, so we've talked through this. You guys understanding that you have heavenly creatures giving glory to God in the temple in heaven, and you have the temple on earth. And should we expect to see creatures like that on the earth?